Hey friends, tonight we begin with dark truth about life in a medieval village. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe only if you truly enjoy this kind of slow, calming storytelling. Your support means the world and helps me keep creating peaceful spaces like this one. Tell me now in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how this little quiet corner of the internet brings together people from all over the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan or some soft background, and let's gently into tonight's journey together. When we think of the medieval world, our minds often go straight to images of knights in shining armor, grand castles on misty hills, or bustling markets where merchants shout over the clamor of the crowd. But beneath those grand, almost romantic images of the Middle Ages, there was a quieter, slower, and far harsher reality. To truly understand what life was like in a medieval village, we have to push aside the stories of kings and queens and look closely at the everyday existence of ordinary people, the peasants, who made up the vast majority of medieval society. The village was the heart of this existence. Small clusters of houses, often little more than rough wooden huts with thatched roofs, were scattered across fields and meadows. These were not places of wealth or comfort. They were practical, simple, and often uncomfortable homes for the people, who spent their lives bound to the rhythm of the land. Imagine, if you will, waking up in such a village. The morning light doesn't slip through glass windows, for glass was a luxury far beyond the reach of most peasants. Instead, the first signs of dawn would filter through shutters made of wood, perhaps a small opening stuffed with cloth or parchment to keep out the chill. The smell inside the cottage would not be fresh or sweet. Smoke from the hearth, because chimneys were rare in early medieval times, would hang heavy in the air. The scent of damp straw, earthy mud, and perhaps even the sharp tang of animals kept indoors during the night would mingle together. For many peasants, animals such as pigs or chickens were not kept in a separate barn. The family's hut and the animal's shelter were one and the same. It was practical, the animal's body. Heat helped warm the cramped room during long winters, and keeping them inside meant they were safe from thieves or predators. But this closeness also meant that daily life was steeped in the mess, noise, and odor of livestock. It was a reality that modern ears might find unpleasant, yet it was entirely ordinary for medieval villagers. The floor beneath your feet would not be polished wood or smooth stone. More often, it was simply packed earth. Sometimes straw would be scattered to soak up the dampness and the filth, and when it grew too dirty, it was swept out and replaced. Furniture was sparse and crude, perhaps a rough wooden stool, a bench, or a low table. Beds, if they could be called that, were little more than piles of straw covered with cloth or animal hides. Families shared them, huddled together for warmth. Privacy was not a concept that existed in these small homes. Daily life revolved around work, and work began early. The rooster's crow or the faint light of dawn was enough to stir households into motion. There was no lingering in bed. The land demanded constant attention, and the seasons dictated every task. Fields had to be plowed and sown in spring, crops weeded and tended in summer, and the harvest gathered in autumn. Winter brought its own challenges, keeping warm, feeding animals, and surviving on whatever stores of grain, dried meat, or root vegetables had been carefully tucked away. But even survival was uncertain. Famine was never far away. A poor harvest could mean hunger, and hunger could mean death, especially for the very young or the very old. Peasants lived on the edge of scarcity. Their diet was simple and monotonous. Dark bread made from coarse grain, porridge, cabbage, onions, and whatever beans or peas could be grown. Meat was rare, reserved for festivals or special occasions, unless a family was fortunate enough to keep a pig or hunt small game in secret. Fish, if near rivers or coasts, supplemented the diet, but even this depended on strict church rules, which dictated when meat could or could not be eaten. The medieval church loomed large over the village. It was not just a place of worship, but the center of community life, the keeper of festivals, and the voice of authority in matters both spiritual and practical. The bell of the church marked the rhythm of days calling villagers to Mass, reminding them of holy days, or signaling important events. The priest held a respected, almost unquestionable position, and religion infused every part of life. Sickness, famine, or misfortune was often seen not as chance, but as divine punishment, while good fortune was viewed as a blessing. Yet despite the closeness of faith, there was a darkness to this existence. Medical knowledge was poor, and superstition often took the place of science. Illnesses swept through villages unchecked. The common cold could weaken someone to the point of death. Plague or fever could spread rapidly, wiping out entire families. There was little recourse beyond prayer, herbal remedies, or the hope of a miracle. The village itself was not a quiet, peaceful place in the way we might imagine. Paths were muddy, filled with refuse, and animals roamed freely. Noise came from the bleating of goats, the clatter of blacksmiths, the chatter of children, and the endless rhythm of labor. Yet it was also a small, tightly knit world where everyone knew each other. A sense of community was strong, for survival demanded cooperation, shared work, shared celebrations, and shared grief-bound villages together. And there were always lords. Above the peasants stood the local lord or landholder, often living in a nearby manor house or castle. Villagers worked not only for themselves, but for him. Much of the land they farmed did not belong to them. It was rented or held in exchange for labor and dues. Days were given over to tending the lord's fields, repairing his roads, or serving in other obligations. Taxes were not paid in coins, for peasants had little money, but in grain, labor, or livestock. The lord's power was absolute, and peasants were bound to his land, often for life. Freedom, for many, was a distant dream. To be a serf meant being tied to the soil, unable to leave without permission, obligated to pass on this same condition to one's children. A few were freemen, able to rent their land more freely, but even they lived under the shadow of lords and kings. The hierarchy of feudal society was rigid, and villagers had little chance of escaping their station. And yet, within this seemingly bleak world, there were moments of joy and color. Festivals were eagerly anticipated. The changing of the seasons brought holidays marked by feasting, dancing, and games. Weddings were celebrated with raucous music, ale, and merriment that could last for days. Storytelling, songs, and folk tales filled the long winter evenings. Even in a world of hardship, people found ways to laugh, love, and hope. The life of a child in a medieval village was not carefree. From a young age, children were expected to help with chore-tending animals, fetching water, gathering firewood, or helping in the fields. Education was rare, reserved for those destined for the church or born into wealth. Most children learned from their parents how to sow, reap, mend, and survive. Childhood, as we understand it, was brief. By the age of 12 or 13, a child was considered nearly an adult, ready to marry, work, or even bear children of their own. The rhythm of village life was slow, bound to cycles of nature and tradition. There was little change from generation to generation. The tools, methods, and routines that a father used were passed to his son, and his son after him. Innovation was rare, and most people lived and died without traveling more than a few miles from where they were born. The village was their entire world, and as the sun sank behind the horizon, life shifted again. The dark of night brought dangers of its own. Without modern lighting, the village became a place of shadows and silence. Candles and oil lamps were precious, used sparingly. Most families retreated indoors, huddling by the hearth. Night was feared, haunted by thieves, wolves, or spirits from folklore. The world beyond the flickering firelight was mysterious and threatening, best left unexplored until dawn returned. This was the texture of everyday existence in a medieval village, a world of hardship, routine, and survival, but also of small joys, deep faith, and enduring human spirit. It was not a glamorous life, nor an easy one, but it was the life that shaped the very foundation of medieval society. If you had stepped inside a medieval village, one of the first things you might notice, beyond the animals, the mud, and the thatch, was the smell. Life in those times was not a clean business. Hygiene, as we understand it today, simply did not exist. The idea of daily baths, scented soaps, and tidy streets would have seemed as strange to a villager as flying in a metal machine across the sky. Bathing was rare, and for most peasants, water was not a friend, but a hazard. Stagnant pools and unclean rivers carried disease, and the connection between water and sickness was not understood in the way it is today. People washed their hands and faces now and then, perhaps rinsed their feet after a long day in the fields, but a full body wash was unusual. Some villages had communal bathhouses, more common in towns than in small rural settlements, but even these fell out of favor as time went on, especially when disease outbreaks made people fear that hot steam and shared water spread illness. Instead of baths, people relied on linen. It might sound odd, but clean linen shirts and undergarments were believed to draw dirt and sweat away from the body. A villager who changed their shirt regularly might be considered quite clean by the standards of the day, even if they hadn't seen a tub of warm water in months. Soap, when it existed, was harsh and homemade, crafted from animal fat and ashes. It served its purpose, but left the skin raw and dry. For most peasants, wiping with a cloth, brushing with straw, or simply enduring the grime was the norm. Toilets, as we know them, were absent. A medieval cottage had no neat little chamber tucked away for privacy. Instead, people used simple pits, dug in the ground, or more often, they relieved themselves outside, in ditches, fields, or against the edge of the yard. In towns, chamber pots were common, and their contents were thrown into the streets, sometimes with a quick shout to warn passers-by below. In villages, waste mixed with animal dung and household refuse, feeding the ever-present stench of daily life. It is no wonder that disease traveled easily. Illness was the shadow that hung constantly over a medieval village. Life expectancy was short. Many did not live beyond 30 or 40 years, and infant mortality was high. A child's survival past the age of 5 was never guaranteed. Without doctors in the modern sense, villagers turned to herbal remedies, midwives, and wise women who knew the secrets of plants. A tea brewed from chamomile, a poultice of honey and herbs, or a tonic of garlic and wine might be prescribed for common ailments. Some treatments worked, though perhaps more by luck than design, but others were dangerous or useless. Superstition filled the gaps where knowledge faltered. Illness could be explained by curses, bad spirits, or God's punishment for sins. Charms and prayers were as important as herbs. The alignment of stars, the phases of the moon, or the presence of witches could all be blamed for misfortune. To live in a medieval village was to live in a world where mystery overshadowed reason, where the unseen was feared as much as the seen. But superstition did not end with medicine. It colored every part of life. A villager might spit 3 times, over their shoulder to ward off evil, or they might nail a horseshoe to a doorway for luck. The sudden cry of an owl in the night could send shivers down spines, believed to herald death or disaster. A woman accused of witchcraft could be shunned, punished, or worse, simply because her neighbors grew suspicious after a cow died or a crop failed. The thin line between survival and disaster meant that fear and suspicion were constant companions. Law and order in a village were crude, yet deeply felt. Most disputes were settled locally, under the eye of the Lord Steward, or through gatherings of villagers. Theft of grain, damage to crops, or disputes over land could all bring someone before the manorial court. Punishments ranged from fines and forfeitures to public humiliation. Stocks and pillories were used not only in towns but in villages too. To sit with one's head and hands locked in place while neighbors mocked through refuse or spat was as much a punishment of shame as of discomfort. More serious crimes could mean brutal penalties. A thief might lose a hand. A murderer might face hanging. Justice was harsh, and mercy was rare. The fear of punishment and the shame of public disgrace served as strong deterrents in a small community, where everyone's lives were intertwined. Even lesser forms of discipline could sting. Children might be whipped for disobedience, peasants fined for failing to show up for the Lord's labor, or women punished for scolding too harshly or gossiping too freely. The control of behavior was not just about law, but about order, about keeping a fragile community from splintering under the pressures of hunger, poverty, and fear. Night in the village deepened these fears. Darkness was a different world, filled with sounds that were both ordinary and ominous. The creak of the rafters, the cry of a fox, or the howl of a wolf might echo through the stillness. Without lamps to drive away the shadows, the imagination filled in the gaps. Tales of wandering spirits, ghostly monks, or restless souls haunted the minds of villagers. Many would not dare step outside after sundown, believing that witches gathered under the cover of night, or that the devil himself roamed the roads in search of straying souls. And yet, amid the dirt, the smells, and the fear, life pressed on. People adjusted because they had no choice. What to us might seem unbearable was to them simply the way things were. The rhythm of the day, the cycle of the seasons, and the certainty of death and birth wove together into a life that, while harsh, had its own kind of order. It was not a world of comfort, but it was a world of meaning, where each small task carried weight, and each survival through another winter was a victory. The medieval villager lived close to the earth, in ways we cannot easily imagine today. They touched it with their hands, felt it beneath their bare feet, and trusted it to yield enough to keep them alive. And though life was short, it was lived fully marked by rituals, traditions, and a constant awareness of both fragility and endurance. If you want to understand the heartbeat of a medieval village, you must look at the table, or, more accurately, the humble wooden board stretched across trestles that served as one. Food was life, and food was struggle. The diet of a villager was simple, monotonous, and tied entirely to the harvest. Bread was the staple, the very core of existence, made from coarse grains barley, rye, or oats for the poorer folk, and occasionally wheat if they were lucky. It was dark, heavy, and filling. A loaf was not a soft, airy treat, but a dense mass meant to satisfy hunger for as long as possible. Alongside bread, pottage was common, a thick, bubbling stew of whatever vegetables and scraps were available. Cabbage, leeks, onions, and beans found their way into the pot, flavored with herbs, and perhaps a morsel of bacon or a bone for broth if the family could spare it. Meat was rare for peasants. A chicken might be slaughtered on a festival day, but more often it was kept for its eggs. A pig was precious, providing fat, salted pork, and sausages to last through the winter. Cows meant milk, butter, and cheese, small luxuries that made the difference between endurance and starvation. Fish, dried or salted, was a common fallback, especially for those near rivers or streams. On certain church days, when meat was forbidden, fish took on an even greater importance. For drink, ale was safer than water, brewed weak for daily use. It quenched thirst without the dangers of contaminated streams. Stronger ales or meads might appear on feast days, but for the most part, a villager's cup held a simple, mild brew that was part nourishment, part necessity. The rhythm of meals followed the rhythm of the workday. A morning bite of bread, a midday break in the fields for more of the same, and a heavier supper when work was done. Hunger was a constant presence, never far from mind. A good harvest brought relief, but a bad one spelled disaster. Famine was the terror that haunted every village. Too much rain, too little rain, a late frost, or a swarm of pests could ruin a year's crops. Grain stores might dwindle before the next harvest was ready, leaving families weak and desperate. Bread was mixed with husks, weeds, or ground beans to stretch it further, but it became bitter and less nourishing. In the worst years, people foraged in the woods, searching for acorns, roots, or anything that might fill the belly. Hunger gnawed, not just at the body, but at the spirit. Yet even in such hardship, there were moments of celebration. The medieval calendar was rich with festivals tied to the church and the seasons. Harvest time brought feasts and revelry, with villagers dancing in the fields. Music played on pipes and drums, and mugs of ale passed around in cheer. Christmas, Easter, and Saints' Days punctuated the year with ritual and joy. These were not mere holidays. They were essential pauses in the grinding cycle of labor, reminders that life, however difficult, still held light. May Day might see garlands of flowers, dances around a pole, and games that brought laughter to the village. Green. Weddings, too, offered rare occasions of merriment, with food shared, songs sung, and a brief escape from the weight of daily struggle. Even funerals, solemn as they were, gathered the community together in solidarity, binding them tighter through. Shared loss, gender roles shaped much of village life. A man's duty was to labor in the fields, tend to livestock, and fulfill the obligations owed to the lord of the manor. A woman's work was no less demanding, caring for children, preparing food, spinning, weaving, brewing ale, and tending. To the garden, she might also help in the fields when hands were short, especially during planting or harvest. Work was never confined neatly to one space. Everyone in the household contributed, and survival depended on it. children were not spared. From a young age, boys and girls were expected to help fetching water, gathering firewood, chasing animals from crops, or helping to care for younger siblings. Play existed, of course, simple games with sticks, stones, or hand-carved toys, but it was woven into a life of labor. Childhood was short, for responsibility arrived early. The social fabric of the village was tightly woven, but also rigid. The lord of the manor, though often distant, held authority over the peasants who farmed his land. Obligations of labor and dues were owed, and though customs varied from place to place, the pattern remained. Peasants worked the land, and the lord took his share. The church, too, demanded its tithe, the portion of produce or coin offered to God's house. Between lord and priest, little was left, and yet villagers carried on, bound by the duties of their station. Despite the burdens, there was pride in survival, in seeing another harvest gathered, in keeping children fed through winter, in mending what was broken and making do with what could not be replaced. The medieval village was no place of ease, but it was a place of resilience, yet beneath the surface of routine lay constant tension. Hunger pressed from one side, disease from another. Fear of sin, fear of punishment, and fear of death hung always nearby. And still, life carried on. A smile could be found in a shared loaf, a laugh in the warmth of the hearth, a moment of peace in a song sung at dusk. To the villagers, these small joys were not luxuries, but lifelines. The truth of medieval village life was neither pure misery nor rosy simplicity. It was the narrow path walked between survival and despair, illuminated now and then by brief sparks of joy. To live in such a place was to endure, but also to belong, to be bound to earth, to time, and to each other in ways we can scarcely imagine today. If food and labor shaped the rhythm of the body, then law and faith shaped the rhythm of the mind. A medieval village was not just a place of toil. It was also a place where the invisible forces of authority and belief pressed down on every life, reminding villagers of their place, their duties, and their frailty. Justice, in the village, was rarely impartial and rarely kind. The law was the lord's, the church's, and sometimes both together. Villagers accused of wrongdoing might find themselves judged not by distant kings or learned men, but by the manorial court, presided over by the lord's steward or bailiff. There, disputes over land boundaries, unpaid dues, or theft of livestock were heard. The punishment was often swift and severe. Stealing a loaf of bread or a chicken might lead to a fine, a whipping, or worse. For greater crimes, stocks awaited on the village green, where the guilty were fastened and left for all to jeer at. Humiliation was punishment in itself, a reminder to others that disobedience carried consequences. At times, execution was the fate of those who transgressed too far. Hanging from the gallows at the edge of the village, the body of the condemned served as a chilling warning. Justice was not abstract, it was physical, visible, and terrifying. But the greatest authority did not come from the Lord's men. It came from the church. In the medieval village, faith was not just belief. It was law, culture, and the very lens through which life was understood. The church stood at the center of the village, its bells marking the hours, its services guiding the week, its holy days shaping the year. Every villager was tied to it, not only by faith, but by obligation. Tithes were demanded 1/10 of what a family grew or earned, and refusal was unthinkable. Priests wielded immense power, for they controlled not just ritual, but the fate of souls. The fear of eternal damnation weighed heavily. Sins were confessed, penances given, and forgiveness sought. The people were told that their suffering in this life might be redeemed in the next. That poverty and hardship could be endured if they remained obedient to God and the Church. Yet alongside official faith, there lived another layer of belief superstition. Villagers feared not only sin but spirits, omens, and witches. A strange illness, a failed harvest, or a cow that refused to give milk might be blamed on unseen forces. Charms, herbs, and whispered prayers were part of daily life. Old women with knowledge of healing herbs might be respected one day and accused of witchcraft the next. The line between faith and fear was always thin. The medieval villager lived in a world where the supernatural was as real as the earth beneath. Their feet, a comet in the sky, a sudden storm, or the birth of a malformed child might be seen as a sign of God's wrath. Ghost stories lingered around hearth fires, tales of restless souls wandering fields, or demons waiting to tempt the unwary. Sleep itself was not always safe, for dreams were thought to carry messages, warnings, or temptations. Death, too, was never far away. Disease, accident, hunger, or childbirth could claim life suddenly. Few lived beyond their 30s or 40s, and infant mortality was high. Funerals were community events, with the whole village turning out to escort the body to the churchyard. Burial was not simply the laying of a body to rest, it was the placement of a soul into God's keeping oar. So it was hoped, and yet there was familiarity in death. It was not hidden away as it is today, but ever present, woven into the fabric of life. Children grew up watching grandparents die, livestock slaughtered, neighbors carried to the grave. To the villagers, death was not stringent, was expected. The terror lay not in dying, but in what came after. Heaven was the hope, but hell was the fear. Sermons painted it in vivid detail: fire, torment, endless punishment for those who strayed. To live in a medieval village was to carry these fears constantly, to work the fields under the watchful eye of the steward, to kneel before the priest, and confess, to whisper charms against spirits in the night. The balance of survival was not just physical, but spiritual. Life was lived in a state of tension between hunger and hope, between law and mercy, between heaven and hell, and still, life persisted. Villagers married, raised children, sang songs, and told stories. They found joy even as fear surrounded them, laughter even as hardship pressed them down. The dark truth of a medieval village is not that it was only suffering, but that suffering and joy lived side by side, inseparable. To be a villager was to endure, to believe, and to keep moving forward despite everything. If you picture a medieval village, you might imagine the sound of hammers in the smithy, cows grazing in a green pasture, and smoke curling lazily from cottage chimneys. But beneath this familiar scene lurked something less romantic, something foul, dangerous, and always threatening to spill into every part of life: filth. A medieval village was not a clean place. Mud clung to the lanes in every season, made worse by the constant passing of animals. Pigs rooted freely near cottages, chickens scattered droppings across doorsteps, and cattle left their heavy marks where they were driven. Rain turned streets into sludge, summer baked waste into hard crust, and in winter the cold trapped it all beneath frost. Villagers accepted this as normal. After all, there was no sanitation as we understand it today. Human waste was often tossed into ditches or cesspits dug beside homes. When these overflowed, The contents seeped into the soil or ran down towards streams, the same streams from which people fetched water to drink and cook. The smell was inescapable, drifting through narrow alleys, clinging to clothing, rising from stagnant pools where refuse collected. For the medieval villager, it was simply part of existence. For us, it would be unbearable. This lack of sanitation came with deadly consequences. Disease spread swiftly in such conditions, leaping from one cottage to another. Typhoid, dysentery, and parasites were common companions. A single sip of unclean water could bring days of agony, even death. Infants and children were most at risk, their fragile bodies unable to withstand repeated waves of illness. Many families buried more children than they raised. And then there were the plagues, the specters that returned again and again to remind the villagers how fragile life could be. The most infamous, of course, was the Black Death of the 14th century. It swept through towns and villages alike, carried by fleas and rats, leaving behind a trail of corpses and despair. In some villages, entire families vanished. Survivors watched neighbors collapse, swell with dark buboes, and die within days. To them, it was not a scientific phenomenon, but divine punishment. Some prayed harder, others panicked and fled, but few were spared. Even when great plagues subsided, smaller outbreaks lingered. Fevers of unknown origin would sweep through hamlets, taking children, elders, and mothers alike. Leprosy haunted the medieval imagination, its sufferers marked and outcast, forced to live apart from the community. To be ill was not just a physical affliction, it was a spiritual stain. Priests spoke of sickness as a test, or as a sign of sin. People blamed miasma, bad air, or the wrath of God, for they had no knowledge of germs. Medicine, such as it was, offered little comfort. Villagers might seek the help of a local wise woman who used herbs and charms handed down through generations. Willow bark for pain, garlic for infection, honey for wounds. Some of these remedies contained real medicinal properties, though no one knew why. Others were rooted in superstition, amulets to ward off evil, powders made from ground animal bones, or prayers whispered over a sick bed. For those who could reach a physician, the treatments were often worse than the illness itself. Bleeding was common, as doctors believed bad humors imbalances in blood. Phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile caused disease. Leeches might be applied or veins opened with a knife. Purging was another method, forcing the body to expel imagined poisons through vomiting or laxatives. Patients grew weaker, but doctors claimed the sickness was leaving the body. Childbirth was perhaps the most dangerous ordeal of all. Every woman knew that labor could claim her life. Midwives guided births with experience, herbs, and prayers, but complications were frequent. Without modern medicine, infections after delivery were common, and many mothers died within days. Infants, too, were perilously fragile, with high mortality rates. A woman might bear 10 children and see only half survive into adulthood. The grief of burying a child was not rare, it was woven into family life, endured again and again. The home itself was a place of hazards. Cottages were small, smoky, and poorly ventilated. Fires burned constantly on open hearths, filling the air with soot. Children stumbled near flames, clothing caught, and burns were common. Roofs leaked, letting in damp that bred sickness. Beds with simple pallets stuffed with straw, sometimes shared by the whole family. Even livestock in winter. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs thrived in the warmth, biting constantly. spreading discomfort and infection. Rats scuttled across rafters at night, gnawing at stored grain, carrying fleas that could unleash yet another wave of sickness. The scratch of vermin in the dark was as ordinary as the crowing of roosters at dawn. Villagers lived side by side with pests, too busy surviving to banish them. Yet, amidst all this danger, villagers endured. They learned to live with sickness, to care for one another when illness struck, and to find meaning in suffering. Faith offered solace. Priests reassured them that pain was a passage, that trials on earth could lead to salvation in heaven. Bells tolled for the dead, prayers were said, and life went on. Still, the shadow of disease was never far. Every cough might signal more than a cold. Every fever could spread through a household. Every crowded gathering risked new contagion. In a village where food was scarce, water was dirty, and medicine was primitive, survival was never guaranteed. The medieval villager lived with death not as a rare shock, but as a constant companion. And yet, they laughed, married, and danced at feasts. They found joy even in a world of danger. This duality, the mingling of fear and resilience, was at the core of life in a medieval village. If the shadow of disease haunted every villager, hunger stood even closer, pressing itself against the very skin. For in a medieval village, food was never a certainty. It was a prize, a gamble, a constant worry that shaped every decision. Bread was the heart of survival. The humble loaf carried the weight of life itself, made from barley, rye, oats, or on the rarest of occasions, wheat bread was the daily sustenance of peasants. Its taste shifted with fortune. In good years, when harvests were plentiful, villagers baked coarse but filling loaves that could last for days. In lean years, the flour was stretched with beans, peas, even ground up acorns. The darker the bread, the poorer the family. The process of making bread was itself a ritual of survival. Grain had to be grown, harvested, dried, threshed, ground into flour at the Lord's mill, and then baked. Each step was vulnerable to failure. Too much rain could rot the grain in the fields. Too little could stunt the stalks. Rats could eat. Stores. Milling came with a tax, a portion skimmed for the Lord. A family's entire existence could hinge on these fragile stalks of grain. Hunger was never far away. A single bad harvest rippled through the village, tightening belts, forcing families to ration. A second bad harvest could spell catastrophe. Famine was not an abstract fear, it was lived reality. Whole villages weakened. Children with swollen bellies and hollow eyes sat quietly by cottage fires, and elders sometimes gave their portions to the young. Survival meant sacrifice, and it was not only hunger, but the quiet poison of malnutrition that stalked villagers. Their diet, dominated by bread and pottage, thick stew of grains. Beans and whatever vegetables were at hand lacked variety. Meat was rare, a luxury eaten on feast days or stolen in small bites by hunters who risked harsh penalties for poaching. When meat did appear, it was often salted or smoked to preserve it, tough and heavily flavored with whatever spices could disguise the taste of age. Fresh fruit and vegetables were seasonal and limited. Milk, when available, was quickly turned into cheese to last longer. This monotony left bodies weak. Bones were brittle from lack of calcium. Teeth rotted quickly, stained and broken, often lost by middle age. Iron deficiency made many pale and weary. Children grew thin and stunted, their growth slowed by years of poor diet. A peasant who lived into their 40s carried the frame of someone older, bent and worn, aged by hunger more than by years. And then came the tainted food. Without modern storage, rot crept swiftly into supplies. Grain might be infested with weevils, and flour laced with insects. Rye, in particular, carried a silent danger. Ergot, a fungus that thrived in damp storage. Villagers did not know its cause, only its effexor, burning in the limbs. Hallucinations, seizures, and in some cases death. Some called it St. Anthony's fire. To eat tainted bread was to gamble with madness and flame in the veins. Water, too, carried risk. With streams polluted by waste, villagers often turned to ale. Weak ale, brewed daily, was safer than water and became the common drink even for children. But brewing required grain, and when grain ran short, so did drink. On desperate days, some returned to the stream, lifting cloudy water to their lips, praying it would not carry sickness. Parasites thrived in such conditions. Worms lodged in stomachs, sapping strength, making every meal less nourishing. Lice and fleas spread easily in crowded cottages. Even the simplest meal could be shared unwillingly with pests. To scratch, to itch, to feel the crawling beneath. The skinnet was part of life, endured with weary resignation. Food was also deeply tied to faith. The church dictated fasting days, when meat and rich foods were forbidden. For peasants, already living on the edge of starvation, this might mean little difference, but the spiritual weight mattered. To eat the wrong food on the wrong day was a sin, one that could endanger the soul. Hunger, then, was not only physical, it was moral. Every mouthful carried the weight of religion. The calendar itself revolved around survival. Harvest season was a frenzy of labor. Every villager in the fields from dawn until dusk, gathering, threshing, storing. Failure here meant suffering later. Winter was the true test, when stores ran low, when cupboards grew bare, when snow sealed fields and game alike. Families huddled around hearths, stretching thin pottage, eking out the last of the grain, praying the season would pass before their supplies did. And in famine years when stores were gone, villagers turned to desperate measures. Leaves, roots, bark, anything that could be boiled into thin gruel. Some scavenged carrion, some ate cats or dogs. The line between survival and despair blurred. Hunger stripped away pride, reducing life to its most basic fight. Yet even in this, there was resilience. Shared meals bound families together. A pot of pottage was a communal thing, stirred by many hands, eaten from one bowl. Children learned early to dip their wooden spoons and wait their turn. Feasts, when they came at weddings, harvest festivals, or church holidays, were treasured memories, moments of abundance that broke the monotony. Roasted meat, fresh bread, sweet honey, these were not just foods, but symbols of joy, glimpses of heaven in an earthly struggle. Food shaped the rhythm of life. Hunger dictated work, prayer, even dreams. To eat one's fill was rare enough to be remembered for years. To go without was common enough to shape a lifetime. In the medieval village, survival was written in bread crusts and empty bowls, and no matter how much toil was given to the soil, there was never a promise that it would give back enough. If hunger and disease shaped the daily struggle of villagers, the greater force behind both was nature itself. The medieval peasant lived in the shadow of the sky, utterly dependent upon the weather. Every harvest, every loaf of bread, every warm breath of survival was tied to the fickle balance of sun and rain. Too much of one, too little of the other, and the fragile thread of life could snap. In spring, hope always returned. The ground softened, shoots broke through the soil, and villagers whispered prayers of thanks. But hope was always mixed with fear. A sudden frost could kill young sprouts in a single night, leaving blackened fields behind. Hailstorms could shred crops in minutes. The sound of ice against earth, a cruel drumbeat of ruin, and heavy rains. When they lingered, drowned the land, turning farmland into a swamp, rotting seed before it ever had a chance to grow. Summer heat brought its own dangers. A drought could bake the soil until it cracked, leaving stalks shriveled and brown, grains thin and hollow. Wells ran low, streams dried to trickles, and livestock staggered weakly in the fields. Villagers knew that every dry day meant less bread. In the winter, that every cloudless sky carried the taste of hunger. Autumn was both blessing and judgment. The harvest revealed what fortune or misfortune the year had decided. Fields heavy with grain meant full stores, warm hearths, a chance at rest. Thin harvests meant a winter of gnawing stomachs. Villagers worked tirelessly in those weeks, from the first light of dawn to the fading of dusk, scythes sweeping through fields, bundles stacked high. The air smelled of cut straw, sweat, and the faint sourness of fear. For even when the fields looked plentiful, there was no guarantee that stores would last. Rats burrowed into granaries, dampness spoiled sacks. One careless fire could wipe out months of labor. Winter was the hardest season. The cold pressed against walls, seeped through thatched roofs, and froze water in wooden buckets. Snow muffled the land, cutting off villagers from roads and markets. Travel became dangerous, if not impossible. Families huddled close to fires, rationing their food, waiting for the thaw. In good years, supplies held out. In bad years, cupboards grew bare long before spring. Villagers looked at their stores with counting eyes, dividing portions, whispering. Worries. The hungry gap came each year, the bleak stretch, between the last of the old stores and the first of the new growth. It was a season of thin faces, weak limbs, and endless waiting. Even those who had survived many winters never grew used to the hollow ache of it, and when nature turned cruel, famine arrived. One bad harvest could be endured with hardship. Two in a row meant disaster. The Great Famine of the early 14th century stood as the darkest reminder. Rain fell without end, year after year. Fields drowned, crops failed, livestock starved. Villages across Europe suffered, entire communities reduced to skin and bone. Accounts tell of desperate measures, of parents abandoning children, of people eating cats, dogs, even the bark stripped from trees. Hunger blurred the line between human and animal. Natural disasters struck with little warning. Floods swept away cottages, drowning fields and families alike. Storms toppled trees, tore at roofs, and scattered thatch like straw dolls. Lightning struck barns, igniting fires that consumed stored grain in moments. For a village with so little margin, such disasters were not merely inconveniences. They were tragedies that rippled through every life. Cold years came like curses. The so-called Little Ice Age in medieval Europe shortened growing seasons, bringing harsher winters and cooler summers. Crops ripened late, or not at all. Frost in August could kill hopes of a full harvest. Villagers feared the sky, watching clouds, winds, and birds for omens. Every shift in the weather was a message, every storm a warning, every rainbow a fragile promise. Beyond hunger, disasters shook faith itself. The church preached that famine and storm were punishments sent by God for sins committed by villagers or their lords. To suffer was to be chastised, to endure was to be tested. In chapels, villagers prayed for mercy, lighting candles, offering coins, confessing sins. But when prayers went unanswered, despair crept in. Some whispered of curses, of witches in their midst, of evil eyes cast upon the fields. Fear sought a face to blame, and yet, despite everything, the village endured. They tilled again in spring, planted in hope, harvested with gratitude, even knowing that the next year could betray them again. To live in a medieval village was to live with uncertainty, to measure time not in days or months, but in seasons, each one a chance at survival or ruin. The earth was both mother and tyrant. It fed and it starved, it blessed and it destroyed. A medieval peasant lived not against nature, but beneath it, always bending, always fearing, always clinging to the hope that the next harvest would be kind. The beating heart of a medieval village was not its church, spire, or its market square, but the endless rhythm of work. Life was a cycle of labor, woven from dawn to dusk, season to season. And the truth was simple. There was no rest in a medieval village. Rest was a luxury for the wealthy, not for the peasant. For those bound to the soil, work was as constant as breath. From the first grey light of morning, villagers stirred. The rooster's cry was more than a sound, it was a summons. Men and boys pulled on rough wool tunics, strapped leather belts round their waists, and stepped into boots stiff with yesterday's mud. Women bound their hair, fastened aprons over linen shifts, and hurried to stir the hearth. Children rubbing sleep. From their eyes, followed behind, already knowing that a day without work was a day wasted. Fields were the great devourer of time. Ploughing, sowing, weeding, harvesting, each task was back-breaking and relentless. Ploughs were heavy wooden frames, tipped with iron, dragged by oxen that needed coaxing and constant care. A man would walk miles behind the beasts in a single day, pushing, guiding, shouting, his body bent and blistered. Weeding was tedious, done by hand, knees sinking into wet earth, fingers raw from pulling. Harvest demanded speed-swinging scythes in wide arcs, gathering bundles under the late summer sun, sweat stinging eyes, muscles burning. But work was not confined to the fields. Women carried their share of labor too, and more. After tending small kitchen gardens, they spun wool, churned butter, brewed ale, fetched water, and mended clothing. Their arms ached from kneading dough, their backs from lifting pails, their fingers from sewing by the dim light of rush lamps. Children carried smaller burdens, fetching kindling, watching geese, scaring birds from crops, but even their play was tied to work. A stick could be a toy, yes, but also a tool to drive pigs from the path. No task was too small to matter. A bucket of water, carried from the village well, could mean life if the fields were parched. Firewood gathered at dusk meant warmth through the night. Every hand had to contribute. Idleness was scorned. A man who shirked his duty drew the anger of neighbors. For in a village where survival was shared, one person's laziness could mean hunger for all. Work carried with it a constant weight of exhaustion. Backs bent early in life, spines curved. Before their time, hands grew calloused, joints stiff. Men in their 40s often looked like old men, their faces lined, their teeth worn down. Women bore children and burdens in equal measure, their bodies stretched, scarred, and tired long before middle age. Fatigue was not something to be shaken, off it was the condition of life itself. Tools offered little relief. A scythe dulled. Quickly, a plough broke often, and repairs cost time or coin. There were no machines to ease the load, no engines to replace muscle. The peasant's strength was his only resource, his body his only machine. And when that machine faltered, when a man's back gave out or a woman's hands trembled too much to spin, the village grew a little colder toward them. For those unable to work, charity was uncertain, and pity ran thin when food was scarce. The church preached that labor was holy, a penance and a path to salvation. Priests reminded villagers that work was the punishment of Adam, the curse laid upon all humanity. To sweat in the fields was not only survival, it was obedience to God. Many villagers found comfort in this, the idea that their endless toil had meaning beyond the harvest. Yet others, in the silence of aching nights, surely wondered if holiness was truly hidden in blisters and weariness. And still, the rhythm never stopped. The bell in the church tower rang not only for prayer, but as a reminder of time's passing. It marked the hours of labor, the pause for meals, the return to toil. When daylight faded, villagers trudged home, bodies sore, eyes heavy. Supper was eaten quickly, and sleep came not as rest, but as preparation for another day of work. The cycle wore on through generations. A boy became a man in the same fields his father had ploughed. A girl became a mother in the same cottage her mother had scrubbed. Work was inherited, passed down like land or tools. And though each generation dreamed of easier days, none came. The land gave, but only if taken with sweat and sacrifice. Leisure existed, but it was rare, a brief flame in the long darkness of labor. Festivals, feast days, saints' holidays, these were the moments when the village rested, when men drank ale, when women laughed freely, when children ran without chores to tether them. But such days were counted on fingers, scattered like bright stars across a year of drudgery. For most, the memory of laughter faded quickly beneath the weight of work's return. To live in a medieval village was to know that the body belonged not to oneself, but to the earth, the fields, the seasons. Every muscle, every bone, every breath was in service to survival. The truth was not simply that villagers worked hard, but that their lives were defined by work. It was the shape of existence, the measure of time, the unending song of the village. And when one stopped working, whether through age, illness, or death, the rhythm did not falter. Others stepped in, hands taking tools, feet walking the same furrows. The cycle endured because it had to. To understand the life of a medieval villager, you must imagine society not as a free landscape, but as a pyramid built on power, privilege, and obedience. At the very top sat kings and queens, distant figures whose faces most villagers would never see. Below them were nobles and lords, whose estates stretched across counties, and whose will shaped the lives of those below. Beneath them were knights, clerics, and officials. And at the wide, heavy base of the pyramid lived the villagers, themselves peasants, laborers, and serfs, who bore the true weight of medieval life. A village was rarely independent. Instead, it was tied to a manor, a great estate owned by a lord. This lord might live in a stone castle perched above fields, or in a fortified manor house surrounded by walls and guards. Whether kind or cruel, generous or greedy, the lord was master. His authority extended to land, to law, and to the very lives of those who worked beneath him. Most villagers were not free. Many were serfs-bound to the soil, tied to the land like the crops they planted. A serf could not leave the manor without permission. He could not sell his property freely, nor marry without the lord's consent. In many cases, even the clothes he wore or the animals he kept were subject to the lord's approval. The land did not belong to the peasant. It belonged to the lord, and the villager's right to use it came at a price: labor, rent, and loyalty. Labor obligations were strict. A serf might owe several days each week of work directly on the lord's domain, the lord's personal fields, orchards, or mills. On these days, a man would set aside his own family's crops to plow the lord's land, or a woman would bake and brew for the lord's household. It was labor without pay, a duty written into law and enforced by custom. Afterward, only what time remained could be given to their own survival. Beyond labor, there were dues and rents. A villager might pay in grain, in livestock, in eggs, or in coins if they had them. There were taxes for using the village mill, for baking bread in the communal oven, for brewing ale, for grazing animals in the common pasture. Some lords took a portion of everything, every sack of grain, every piglet born, every calf raised. To live under a lord was to live under constant obligation, a life measured not only in toil but in payments owed. And behind it all stood the manor court, a local system of justice that ensured obedience. The manor court was held in a hall or in the open air, overseen by the lord's steward or bailiff. Villagers were summoned to attend, sometimes several times a year, and fines were handed out for a dizzying array of offences. To miss work on the lord's land might bring a fine. To sell ale without permission might bring another. To let pigs wander into the lord's fields. To gather firewood in the wrong place. To quarrel too loudly with a neighbour all could bring. The weight of the court justice in the village was rarely kind. Petty crimes often meant fines, but when fines could not be paid, harsher punishments followed. Stocks and pillories stood in village squares, where offenders were displayed for public shame. The thief with nimble fingers might find his hand struck or branded. A liar could be forced to confess aloud before his neighbors. And for more serious crimes, murder, arson, rebellion, the punishment could be execution. Gallows stood at crossroads, their stark silhouettes reminding all of the cost of disobedience. But the true cruelty of the system lay not in the punishments themselves, but in their inequality. A lord could commit the same crime as a villager and escape unscathed, shielded by status and power. A peasant, by contrast, had little defense. The law was not blind, it looked upon rank and bent beneath it. Villagers knew this, and though they might mutter complaints in secret, they lived within the system, because to rebel against it was to risk ruin. Religion sanctified this hierarchy. Priests taught that God had ordained the social order. The king ruled by divine right, the lord by noble blood, the peasant by toil and obedience. To question this structure was not only rebellion against men, but sin against God. In sermons, villagers were reminded of their place, told that obedience and humility would be rewarded in the next life, if not in this one. For many, faith softened the bitterness of duty. For others, it made the burden heavier, for even in prayer they could not escape the chains of hierarchy. Still, villagers found ways to bend the rules quietly. A man might sneak into the woods at night to gather more firewood than allowed. A woman might skim grain from her own sack before handing over the Lord's share. Children might herd animals into forbidden pastures, trusting in their speed to escape the bailiff's eye. These small rebellions were dangerous, but they were also necessary. Without them, survival might slip through their hands. The manor system defined life, but within it lay subtle gradations. Not all villages were equally bound. Some were freemen, peasants, who owed fewer obligations and enjoyed a little more independence. A freeman could often sell land, move from one village to another, or bargain with the lord more freely. Yet even freemen were not entirely free. The system pressed down on all, though its weight varied from shoulder to shoulder, and so the rhythm of hierarchy endured. Lords demanded, villagers obeyed, and the system spun on, generation after generation. To be born into a medieval village was not merely to inherit a family's home or land, but to inherit a place in this order or role, written before birth, and rarely changed before death. The story of a medieval village is not only the story of work and survival, it is the story of a people bound in webs of power, tethered to the will of lords and priests, hemmed in by laws and customs they did not choose. It is the story of hierarchy made flesh, of justice made unequal, of obedience demanded and given, because there was no other choice. And yet, within these boundaries, villagers built lives. They found joy in small things, laughter in moments of ease, strength in community. They bore their burdens together, knowing that though the system was harsh, they could at least endure it side by side. A medieval village might look quiet from a distant fields stretching to the horizon. Cottages tucked beneath thatched roofs, smoke curling gently into the sky. But beneath that stillness lurked tension. Fear was a constant companion. Fear of hunger, fear of disease, fear of punishment, and fear of powers that lay beyond the reach of human understanding. Crime in these small communities was not an abstract concern. It lived among the people. A missing chicken could mean a child's empty stomach. A stolen sack of grain might doom a family to starvation. To the villagers, theft was not merely dishonorable, it was dangerous, a direct threat to survival. Even petty crimes carried heavy consequences, because life itself balanced so precariously on each possession. Justice, when it came, was often swift and public. The stocks might be set up in the village square, where the accused sat, trapped with hands and feet bound in wooden boards, jeered at by neighbors who once broke bread with him. Sometimes villagers threw rotten vegetables, sometimes only words. But always the humiliation clung to the offender long after the punishment ended. The community remembered, and memory could be as cruel as the lash. More severe crimes called for harsher measures. Gallows stood outside villages, visible from the fields. They were reminders as much as instruments, a warning to passers-by that the law stretched into every corner of rural life. Executions were public spectacles, and though villagers might claim no taste for blood, they gathered nonetheless. Parents brought children, husbands brought wives, and all watched as rope tightened or blade fell. In the collective silence afterward, the warning echoed. Step outside the order, and the order will crush you. Yet law did not only concern itself with crimes of the body or the field. It tangled itself with superstition, shaping fears into accusations. When crops failed, suspicion fell on neighbors. When cattle sickened, whispers spread of curses. When illness struck a household, eyes turned toward those who lived alone, those who muttered too much to themselves, those who seemed different. Women, especially widows, midwives, and the poor were frequent targets. Though large-scale witch trials would come later in history, the seeds were already sown in the medieval village. Superstition was everywhere. Villagers believed in the evil eye, in charms to ward off spirits, in herbs with hidden power. A scrap of parchment pinned to a door might protect a household. A sprig of rowan or yew might guard against demons. Priests thundered against such practices from the pulpit, calling them pagan remnants, yet many villagers saw no contradiction. To them, the sacred and the superstitious mingled together, each offering protection against an unpredictable world, and the world gave them plenty to fear. Lightning striking a thatched roof could reduce a family's home to ash in minutes. Wolves prowled at the edge of forests, their howls shivering through the night. Bandits roamed the roads, preying on travelers to pour to hire guards. Illness swept through villages without warning. A fever that began as a child's cough could end with a funeral procession. Bells tolling through the mist, punishment for crimes of belief could be brutal. A woman accused of cursing livestock might be forced to prove her innocence through ordeal plunging her hand into boiling water or carrying hot iron to show whether God would protect her. If burns healed clean, she was declared innocent. If they festered, guilt was proven. To modern eyes, such practices seem cruel and absurd, but to the villagers, they were divine judgment. The hand of God reaching into earthly affairs. Sometimes punishment was more symbolic, but no less humiliating. A man who quarreled too violently might be made to walk the village street carrying a heavy stone, mocked by neighbors. A woman who sold weak ale might be dunked in the river, strapped to a chair known as the cucking stool. The cold water shocked her body, but it was the laughter of the crowd that stung deeper. These punishments were designed not just to correct, but to remind. Each villager lived not for himself, but within the gaze of the whole community. The line between crime and sin was thin. To miss church was to risk a fine, and to blaspheme was to risk worse. The church loomed over village life, not only in its sermons, but in its courts. Ecclesiastical judges could summon peasants for accusations as small as slander or gossip. And since confession and penance were bound up with salvation, few dared to resist. Fear of hell was as powerful as fear of gallows. Superstitions and faith overlapped most strongly in times of crisis. In years of famine, villagers might process together behind priests, carrying relics, chanting prayers to beg for rain or sun. In years of plague, when corpses outnumbered coffins, rumors of curses and divine wrath spread swiftly. Crosses were carved into doors, bells rang to ward away the unseen. And yet, nothing stopped the death that swept through homes, leaving children without parents, parents without children, and villages hollow with loss. Punishment was not always meted out by lords or priests. Sometimes the community itself became executioner. Lynchings were rare, but mobs of villagers could turn on one of their own if suspicion grew too heavy. A man accused of thievery might vanish in the night, his body found days later in a ditch. A woman branded as a witch might flee into the forest, never to return. These were not acts sanctioned by law, yet they were tolerated, for fear held stronger sway than justice. All of this produced an atmosphere of constant vigilance. Villagers watched one another, not only to guard against theft, but to guard against suspicion falling on themselves. Words were weighed before being spoken. Actions were measured, lest they offend the wrong person. To survive meant not only tilling the soil and feeding the family, but keeping one's reputation clean in the eyes of neighbors. It is tempting to imagine the medieval village as a place of quaint simplicity, where everyone knew their place and lived in harmony with the land. But beneath the surface, anxiety ran deep. A single misstep, whether in action, in word, or in rumor, could end in punishment, shame, or ruin. Fear kept people in line as surely as faith or duty. And so, villagers walked a narrow path. They rose each morning to tend fields. They paid their dues to the Lord. They prayed for salvation. But always, just behind them, walked the shadow of punishment, the whisper of superstition, the weight of fear. It was the unseen companion of medieval life, inescapable, unrelenting, and ever-present. For all its burdens, medieval village life was not entirely without moments of reprieve. The calendar itself was a cycle of both labor and holy days, and it was on those scattered occasions that villagers found a brief escape from their harsh realities. But even in joy, there lingered an undercurrent of control. For every festival, every gathering was bounded by the expectations of lords, priests, and tradition. The rhythm of the year was tied to the church, and feast days offered rare opportunities. For rest, Christmas was not merely a single day, but a season filled with church services, carols, and small gatherings. Easter, too, drew villagers together in processions and solemn rituals. Between these high holy days stretched countless saints' days, each carrying its own local customs. Villagers celebrated them not only out of faith, but because such days offered respite from the grind of daily toil. Festivals often spilled into the open spaces at the heart of the village. A green or a market square would transform into a stage for merriment. The air filled with music from pipes and drums, and laughter echoed as villagers competed in games of strength or agility. Wrestling matches, archery contests, and simple foot races brought a spark of excitement. Children darted between adults, their laughter momentarily cutting through the fatigue that usually marked their faces. Food was central to these occasions, though it was rarely abundant. Ale flowed more freely than usual, brewed stronger for the season, and shared among neighbors. Bread was baked in larger loaves, sometimes sweetened if honey could be spared. On especially important days, a pig or goose might be roasted, the smell drifting across the village like a promise of warmth and plenty. For people accustomed to monotony at the table, these feasts were treasured memories. Yet even joy had its shadows. Lords often used festivals to remind peasants of their place. While villagers danced and sang, the Lord's steward might walk among them, ensuring rents and dues had been paid. In some manors, lords hosted their tenants at feasts. But even in generosity, there was an unspoken lesson. All that the peasants consumed came by the Lord's permission. The bread, the ale, the meat, it reinforced dependency as much as fellowship. The church, too, shaped every celebration. Priests warned against excess, reminding villagers that joy must always be tempered by piety. Carnival, the season before. Lent was a time when roles could be briefly inverted. Villagers might dress as nobles. Fools might mock the wise. But once Ash Wednesday arrived, the levity ended abruptly. Ashes marked foreheads, and laughter gave way to penitence. Joy was permitted, but only under strict boundaries. Music and dance were cherished, though sometimes frowned upon by clergy. Simple instruments, flutes, drums, fiddles filled the nights with rhythm. Villagers joined hands in circle dances, their movements carrying them through steps passed down across generations. These dances were not refined courtly spectacles. They were rough, lively, and unpolished. Yet for the villagers, they were an expression of freedom. Still, priests often scolded against dancers that grew too wild, warning that sin could be found in too much pleasure. The village fair was another highlight, drawing not only locals but travelers from beyond. Merchants brought goods rarely seen, otherwise salted fish from distant coasts, cloth dyed in colors brighter than homespun wool, small trinkets and knives. Children marveled at jugglers, storytellers, and even performing animals. But fairs were also opportunities for theft, brawls, and gambling, and thus they carried a sense of unease. For every smile, there was suspicion that trouble might be lurking just a few paces away. The darker side of festivals emerged in the way drink loosened tempers. Ale and mead flowed more freely, and disputes, simmering beneath the surface sometimes, erupted into fights. A harsh word, a shove, a spilled cup could ignite a quarrel that ended with bruises or worse. Village constables or stewards intervened when they could, but often these conflicts were resolved by the crowd itself, shoving participants apart, dragging one to the stocks if necessary. In some regions, festivals incorporated rituals that now seemed strange or unsettling. Effigies were burned to banish winter, or mock battles staged to symbolize the triumph of life over death. Masked figures paraded through streets, blending pagan echoes with Christian forms. Villagers accepted these customs as natural, even necessary, believing that the health of crops or livestock depended upon such rites. Beneath the laughter, there was always seriousness. If rituals were neglected, misfortune might follow. Seasonal celebrations tied villagers to the cycles of the earth. At harvest, communities gathered in gratitude. Sheaves of grain were stacked high, and a portion set aside as an offering, lest divine wrath strike the fields the following year. At midsummer, fires were lit on hillsides, their glow visible for miles, believed to ward off evil spirits. Such moments bound the villagers together, yet always beneath the gaze of both heaven and hierarchy. Even marriage, one of the most joyful occasions, bore the weight of control. Weddings were community affairs, but they were also economic arrangements. A union might strengthen ties between families, or ensure a dowry passed to secure land or animals. The celebration that followed was genuine, with song, dance, and feasting. But behind the smiles lingered the knowledge that marriage was not simply about love. It was survival, alliance, and duty. In the same way, birth was greeted with both joy and fear. A christening brought neighbors together, godparents chosen with care, for the child's spiritual future depended upon them. Yet infant mortality was high, and so prayers were whispered urgently over newborns, seeking divine protection. Celebration and sorrow walked side by side, often within the same week, sometimes within the same day. Funerals, too, were communal, and though grief was heavy, they carried a ritual weight that echoed celebration in reverse. The tolling of bells, the procession to the churchyard, the shared meal afterward reminded villagers of the cycle in which they lived. Death was as communal as life. These festivals and rituals might seem to us as moments of escape, and indeed they were cherished for the relief they offered. But they also reinforced the structures that bound medieval villagers. Every joy was tempered by duty. Every laughter echoed with a reminder of who held authority. Merriment was permitted, but it was never free. And so, villagers clung to these occasions with intensity. A single day of music could carry them through weeks of drudgery. A shared loaf of sweetened bread might become a memory repeated through long winters. Even when joy was fragile and fleeting, it was precious. It kept the spirit alive in a world otherwise dominated by fear, labor, and loss. When the music stopped, when the fires burned out, when the ale barrels stood empty, villagers returned to their fields and flocks. The sun rose again, work resumed, and life folded back into its harsh rhythm. But in their minds lingered the laughter, the taste of feast day ale, the glow of a midsummer fire. That memory itself became a kind of survival, a thread of warmth stitched into the fabric of an otherwise unyielding existence. When one looks at the cycle of a medieval village, the endless repetition of labor, the fleeting bursts of joy at festivals, the inevitability of sickness and death, that becomes clear that beneath every aspect of life lay an ever-present awareness of authority. It was not only the Lord who stood above the villagers, though his presence was always felt, but also the church, the weight of custom, and the whispered voice of superstition that pressed down upon every decision. The church tower rose above the fields and cottages, its bell tolling to mark the hours, its walls looming as both sanctuary and warning. Every villager was tied to its rhythm. Sundays were days of obligation. Failure to attend Mass might mark one as suspicious, even sinful. Priests reminded their flocks of their duties: obedience to the Lord, confession of sins, regular fasting, offerings for the poor, and above all, loyalty to God's order. In this order, the villagers stood at the bottom, as humble and expendable as the soil they tilled. Yet faith was not simply fear, it was also comfort. In the dim interior of the church, with candles flickering against stone walls, peasants felt a sense of belonging. They sang hymns together, their voices merging in a harmony that transcended their poverty. They prayed not just for salvation, but for rain in dry months, for protection against storms, for mercy during childbirth. God was distant, yet also intimately tied to every furrow and flock. The balance between comfort and fear, however, tilted easily toward dread. Hell was preached as vividly as heaven, its fires described in detail from the pulpit. A villager who stole, who blasphemed, who broke the commandments, was warned of eternal torment. This imagery clung to the minds of the faithful, shaping their choices, their silences, and their submission. It was not enough to endure hardship on earth. One must also fear the fate of the soul. Beyond the church's authority lay the secular hand of the Lord. The manor court was a place every villager knew well, beneath the shade of a tree or within. The Lord's hall, disputes were heard, arguments over land boundaries, accusations of theft, charges of failing to work the required days. Punishments were swift and public. A thief might be placed in the stocks, his humiliation prolonged by neighbors who jeered or threw refuse. A man who owed debts might have his oxen seized, leaving his fields bare. For more serious crimes, harsher fates awaited branding, mutilation, or in rare cases, execution. These punishments served as lessons. The entire village was meant to witness, to absorb the warning that disobedience carried consequences. The spectacle of justice was as much about reinforcing authority as it was about correcting wrongs. The villagers internalized this, carrying the fear of punishment alongside their fear of sin. Superstition threaded itself through this fabric of control, filling gaps where official authority faltered. If a cow sickened, villagers might whisper of the evil eye. If crops failed, perhaps a charm had been broken, or a witch had cursed the field. Women who lived alone, or those who seemed strange or outspoken, sometimes drew suspicion. Though large-scale witch hunts belonged to later centuries, even in the Middle Ages, suspicion could fester into ostracism, or worse. Fear of the unseen was often more powerful than fear of the known. The seasons themselves seemed to conspire with these anxieties. A storm that flattened fields, a harsh frost that killed seedlings, a summer drought that withered crop soil could be seen as divine, warning or malevolent influence. Villagers sought remedies in herbs, charms, and whispered prayers, blending Christian rituals with ancient folk practices. To ward off illness, amulets might be worn beneath clothing, hidden from the priest's disapproving eyes. To protect a child from spirits, salt might be sprinkled at the doorway. Yet even as superstition provided explanations, it also deepened fear. A bad harvest was not simply misfortune, it was evidence that something had gone wrong in the moral or spiritual balance of the community. Guilt, suspicion, and whispered blame often followed. Families might turn inward, watching neighbors with wary eyes, wondering who among them had offended God or invited misfortune. This atmosphere of fear and authority did not destroy community, but it shaped it. Villagers relied on one another, sharing tools, helping with harvest, watching children when mothers worked the fields. Yet they also knew that a single accusation could shatter bonds. The tension between solidarity and suspicion was constant, and it made life precarious. Children grew up within this world of lessons and warnings. From an early age, they were taught obedience. Disobedience to parents was said to mirror disobedience to God. Boys learned to bow before their elders, to remove caps in the presence of the Lord or priest. Girls were taught modesty, chastity, and the endless cycle of household tasks they would one day take on themselves. Childhood was brief, replaced swiftly by labor, but its lessons were enduring. Survival required submission, and yet, within this controlled and fearful world, villagers found ways to endure. Stories were told by firelight, tales of saints and heroes, of strange creatures in forests and spirits who lingered at crossroads. These stories offered warnings, but also a sense of wonder, a reminder that the world was larger than fields and feudal dues. Laughter, too, was a form of resistance. Jests about the Lord or priest, shared quietly, gave relief. Humor did not erase fear, but it softened it. Authority was everywhere in the medieval village, shaping work, faith, and even joy. It reminded villagers of their smallness in the grand order of things. But villagers were not entirely crushed by it. They endured, adapted, and carved out spaces of resilience within the narrow confines allowed them. Their lives were bound by rules, yet they found meaning in family, in ritual, in fleeting moments of laughter and warmth. As night fell, authority softened its grip for a time. Lords retreated to their halls, priests to their chambers, villagers sat in dim cottages, families gathered around small fires. Shadows flickered against walls, and voices rose in quiet talk. For a few hours, before sleep carried them into dreams, they were free from the gaze of power. In those moments, they belonged to themselves and to one another. It was a fragile reprieve, but one they treasured. For when dawn came again, the tolling of the church bell and the demands of the fields would remind them of their place, and so the cycle turned once more, authority and fear woven into every thread of survival, yet always tempered by the stubborn persistence of life itself. Morning always began with sound. The rooster's crow, the shuffle of feet across earthen floors, the low groan of a barn door pushed open. These were the notes of the village's daily symphony. The air was often cool and damp, laced with the smell of smoke from last night's fire and the faint tang of animals. Before the sun fully lifted, the village was already stirring, each household falling into its rhythm, repeating motions passed down for generations. For the women, the day began with fire, gathering, kindling, coaxing embers back into flame, boiling. Water in iron pots. The act was both routine and essential. Bread had to be prepared, often coarse loaves of barley or rye, dark and heavy with bran. Children might still doze on straw pallets, but the sound of kneading, the scrape of pots, and the clatter of wooden spoons soon roused them. Life left little room for lingering. Men stepped outside to face the land. Oxen had to be yoked fields, plowed, hedges repaired. Tools were crude, often worn down by years of use, but they were precious. A plow could be patched and repatched, its wooden frame bound with iron, each repair stretching its life a little longer. Losing a tool was nearly as disastrous as losing an animal. Both were lifelines, and without them, survival wavered. Children played their part, though play was not the right word. By the time they were old enough to walk steadily, they carried water, collected eggs, gathered firewood, or scared birds from the fields. Their games were woven into chores, chasing one another while herding geese, or shaping mud into pretend castles while hauling clay for repairs. Childhood as we know it did not exist in the medieval village. It was more a brief prelude to labor. The rhythm of work extended beyond the household. Fields had to be worked in common, especially during plowing and harvest. Villagers leaned on one another, tied together by necessity. No single family could manage the scale of labor alone. It was in these shared tasks that bonds formed, even as rivalries simmered quietly beneath. One man might resent his neighbor's larger strip of land. Another might remember a quarrel from last year's festival. Yet, in the field, sickles swung side by side, and backs bent together under the weight of the harvest. Meals were brief pauses in this cycle, more functional than indulgent. A bowl of pottage vegetables, grains, sometimes enriched with a rare piece of meat was the staple. Bread accompanied nearly every meal, its crust coarse, sometimes flavored with herbs if available. Ale was common, brewed weak and consumed even by children, safer than water that might carry unseen dangers. To eat was to fuel the body for work, though hunger was never far from memory. A poor harvest meant thinner portions, fewer loaves, and annoying emptiness that lingered through the winter. The days stretched long. By afternoon, the sun stood high, casting sharp shadows across the thatched roofs. Clothes, rough and homespun, grew damp with sweat. Hands calloused and cracked, backs ached, but still the work pressed on. Every hour of labor promised survival. For the next season, to falter was to risk not only one's own life, but the well-being of family. As dusk approached, the mood shifted. Tools were returned, animals driven back into pens, fires lit once more. Smoke rose from chimneys, carrying with it the smell of stew or roasting grain. Families gathered close, their bodies pressed together for warmth. Conversation was simple, often about the day's work, the health of animals, the rumors of weather. Yet within these conversations lay the threads of memory, each word weaving the fabric of the village's shared story. Night fell quickly in the medieval world, for without the aid of modern light, darkness arrived in full weight. Candles and rushlights offered faint illumination, casting long shadows across rough wooden walls. For most, bedtime came soon after dusk, the exhaustion of the day settling heavily upon limbs. Yet before sleep, there was space for story. It was in these moments, around dim fires, that tales passed from one generation to the next. Stories of saints who worked miracles, of travelers who saw distant lands, of spirits who lingered at crossroads, or haunted abandoned mills. The line between faith and folklore blurred easily, each tale serving as both warning and wonder. To children, these stories were lessons: to obey, to believe, to stay safe. To adults, they were a reminder that life was more than toil, that mystery lingered in the world beyond the fields. Dreams were shaped by these stories as much as by hunger and weariness. A child might dream of knights and castles, of beasts and angels. A woman might dream of relief from endless labor, of fields that bore abundant grain. A man might dream of strength, of fortune, or of fears he dared not voice. The medieval night was long, filled with silence broken only by the howl of wolves at the edge of woodland, or the hoot of an owl. It was a darkness both frightening and strangely comforting, a shroud under which the village rested together. Through this daily cycle, waking, working, eating, sleeping, the medieval village persisted. There was hardship, there was fear, there was hunger. But there was also resilience. It was not the resilience of heroes or kings, but of ordinary people who endured because they had no choice. Their strength was quiet, unsplitted, but it carried the weight of generations. The land demanded everything of them, and still they gave more. The church demanded obedience, and still they prayed. The Lord demanded labor, and still they toiled. And through it all, families clung to one another, neighbors shared burdens, and life continued, turning with the seasons like a wheel that never stopped. This was the truth of the medieval village, not grand battles or royal decrees, but the unending rhythm of survival, the quiet persistence of those who lived unseen in the shadows of history. Not every day was a grind of endless labor. Even in the darkest corners of medieval life, the human spirit reached for light. Festivals, feasts, and rituals punctuated the year, like candles flickering in a long corridor of shadow. To understand the village fully, one must see these brief illuminations. The rare days when the rhythms of survival bent into rhythms of celebration. The church calendar was the great clock by which villagers lived, and it provided both structure and reprieve. Saints' days, feast days, Easter, Christmas each offered a pause from toil, a sanctioned space for festivity. These occasions were not simply about faith, though faith was always present. They were about community, about laughter echoing across muddy lanes, about the chance to forget, if only for a few hours, the weight of hunger and debt. On feast days, the village changed. Instead of the steady clank of tools, one heard music fiddles, pipes, drums beaten by eager hands. Bright ribbons appeared, tied around maypoles or fastened to bonnets. Clothes, usually plain and patched, were brushed clean, and the rarest garments, embroidered tunics, colored caps, jewelry kept carefully hidden most of the year, were brought out into the sunlight. Children ran more freely, their play less, burdened by task, while elders watched with eyes softened by memory. Food, too, was different. A festival meant tables, heavier than usual, with meat sometimes shared widely, bread baked in larger loaves, and ale brewed stronger. The smell of roasting filled the air, a signal that this was no ordinary day. Families pooled resources, neighbors contributed what they could. And though the bounty was not rich by modern standards, it felt abundant to those who lived most days. On thin gruel and crusts of bread, dancing filled the open spaces. Men and women joined hands, their steps guided more by instinct than skill. Moving in circles, stamping feet against the earth. There was a joy in this rhythm, a release of energy built up through long days of labor. Songs rose with the dancing, verses passed down orally, telling of love, loss, and the land itself. Music was a binding force, weaving together voices of old and young, rich and poor. Yet even these bright moments carried shadows. Feasts could breed rivalry whose family provided more, whose daughter danced with which boy, whose voice carried the loudest in song. The church, too, watched closely. Excess was frowned upon. Indulgence reminded parishioners of sin. Still, the people found ways to celebrate. For a few days, the wheel of hardship slowed, and laughter became as vital as bread. Beyond festivals, rituals of life and death shaped the emotional landscape of the village. Baptisms were joyous affairs, binding infants to the church and offering families hope for their child's survival. Weddings carried a similar mix of joy and practicality, joining not only to hearts but to households, to sets of fields, to webs of obligation. Funerals, by contrast, drew the village into solemn unity. Death was no stranger here, but each passing marked the fragility of their existence. Bells tolled, prayers rose, and the community carried the weight together. Superstition threaded through. All of this, the medieval villager did not separate the sacred from the supernatural as we do. A strange noise at night might be a restless spirit. A failed crop might be the work of a witch. Illness might come from demons as easily as disease. Amulets were worn, charms whispered, herbs gathered under the right moon. The church might preach against such practices, but in the privacy of huts, people turned to whatever promise of safety they could grasp. Winter was the hardest season, yet even winter had its rituals. Yule fires blazed against the dark, their warmth symbolic of endurance. Villagers huddled close, sharing stories of ancestors and saints, their voices weaving comfort against the howl of wind outside. These were not just diversions, they were survival strategies, strengthening morale when cold and hunger threatened to break it. Children especially clung to these moments. Their lives were short on playthings, perhaps a rag doll, a carved wooden horse, a ball of leather stuffed with rags, but their imagination was boundless. To them, the winter fire was a stage. Shadows on the wall became giants, flickers of flame became dragons, and the stories of their elders became living worlds. In such imagination, the hardships of life softened for a while. The year's greatest ritual was harvest, both work and celebration entwined. After weeks of labor, sweat stinging eyes, and blisters splitting hands, the grain was gathered. The success of the harvest decided the fate of the village. Too little, and famine loomed. Enough, and relief washed through the community like rain over parched earth. When the last sheaves were stacked, villagers feasted. Bread baked from new grain was broken and shared, symbolizing renewal. For one night, laughter rose freely, music carried into the starry sky, and the burden of survival felt a little lighter. Yet the next morning, the wheel began to turn again. The joy of feast and festival faded back into toil, just as the warmth of fire gave way to cold. Still, the memory of celebration mattered. It reminded villagers that life was more than survival, that they were not just bodies laboring for lords and priests, but souls capable of joy. In truth, this balance of darkness and light defined the medieval village. The hardship was constant, but so was resilience. The fear of hunger was sharp, but so was the sweetness of shared bread. The church demanded obedience, but in their songs and stories, villagers carved out a freedom of spirit. The land was unforgiving, but within its cycles came moments of renewal, seasons that reminded them that after winter, spring would always return. If we strip away the romance of history and look closely, we see not faceless peasants, but human beings, laughing, weeping, hoping, fearing, enduring. They were not so different from us. Their joys were simpler, their sorrows harsher, but their humanity rings across the centuries. And so, when we imagine the medieval village, let us not see only mud and misery, nor only quaint cottages and merry dancers. Let us see both the toil and the tenderness, the pain and the perseverance. For it is in this balance that the truth resides, the truth of lives lived fully, even in the shadow of hardship. The village may appear, at first glance, to be a world unto itself, fields, cottages, a church at its center, the steady cycle of labor and rest. But no village was truly isolated. The wider world, vast and often violent, pressed upon it constantly, shaping lives in ways that villagers could not always control. Lords, kings, wars, and pestilence were distant forces, yet their consequences fell squarely on the shoulders of ordinary men and women. The lord of the manor was the most immediate power. His hall loomed larger than any peasant's hut, often built upon a rise, symbolizing his dominance. To the villagers, he was not just a landlord, but the embodiment of authority, justice, and, sometimes, oppression. He claimed rents, demanded labor, and enforced the laws of his estate. The villagers owed him not only their work in the fields, but also various dues fees for using his mill, his oven, his winepress. A peasant might labor from dawn to dusk on his own small strip of land, yet still find himself summoned to tend the Lord's fields. Justice was meted out in the Lord's court. Disputes over land, theft, accusations of wrongdoing all came before this rough tribunal. The punishments could be severe: fines, public humiliation, even physical penalties. Yet the villagers had little choice but to accept them, to resist. The Lord's authority was to risk ruin, exile, or worse. Above the Lord stretched the hierarchy of the kingdom. Taxes were levied not only for the manor, but for the crown. Armies demanded resources. If a king declared war, if foreign enemies threatened, the village felt the cost. Knights often sworn to their lord, sometimes rode through, their armor gleaming, their banners snapping in the wind. To peasants, they were figures of awe and terror. Chivalry was the stuff of stories, but the reality was harder. Soldiers needed food, horses needed stabling, supplies were taken. A village might see its barns emptied overnight to support campaigns far beyond the horizon. War itself was not distant for long. Raiding bands could sweep across the countryside, burning crops, trampling fields, seizing livestock. The villagers' huts, built of timber and thatch, stood no chance against fire. Those who survived fled to forests or churches for shelter, clutching children and whatever possessions they could carry. When armies clashed nearby, it was the peasants who suffered most, caught between rival powers, their homes treated as spoils. Perhaps the greatest shadow over medieval life was the plague. The Black Death of the 14th century swept into villages like a storm, silent at first, then devastating in its fury. No one understood its cause. Rumors abounded: bad air, divine punishment, the work of witches or foreigners. But the effect was undeniable. Entire families wiped out, cottages abandoned, churchyards overflowing. Bells tolled endlessly, their mournful sound marking death after death. Survivors lived in terror, not knowing who would be next, not knowing whether their prayers would be answered. The plague reshaped villages. Laborers were fewer, and suddenly their work became more valuable. Some seized opportunities, demanding higher wages or seeking freedom from the land. Lords resisted, kings passed laws to freeze wages, but the social order cracked. For a time, peasants glimpsed a different kind of power born, not from wealth or arms, but from necessity. Beyond plague and war, even distant politics seeped into village life. A king's marriage, a pope's decree, a rebellion hundreds of miles away, these might seem irrelevant to those sowing barley or herding sheep, but ripples reached them all the same. A change in law altered their rents. A rebellion meant new soldiers marching through. A shift in church policy demanded new tithes or altered rituals. Villagers were subjects not only of their lord, but of forces so vast they could barely comprehend them, and yet the medieval villager was not entirely powerless. They grumbled, they bargained, they adapted. When taxes grew unbearable, they hid grain or drove livestock into the woods. When the church demanded more, they quietly practiced old traditions under cover of darkness. When lords pressed too hard, peasants rose up. Rebellions were rare and dangerous, but they did happen flames of resistance, sparked by injustice, fueled by desperation. Some were crushed swiftly, others shook kingdoms. Even in the smallest hamlet, whispers of revolt could spread, carried in hushed voices around hearth fires. Despite hardship, many villagers rarely traveled far from home. Their world stretched only a few miles. Fields, church, market town. Yet they knew of larger events through rumor, through traveling merchants, through priests whose sermons carried news. Stories of crusades, of kings crowned and slain, of saints performing miracles, filtered into the village, shaping their sense of a wider, mysterious world. Pilgrimage was one way villagers reached beyond their boundaries. To journey to a holy site was both spiritual and social. Some traveled to nearby shrines, others dreamed of far-off Compostela or Canterbury. These journeys offered rare glimpses of other lands, other customs, and sometimes they brought back stories that widened the horizons of the entire village. But more often, villagers stayed where they were, rooted in earth, tilled by their ancestors, bound to the same manner, generation after generation. The outside world might thunder above them, kings warring, popes declaring, cities rising, but their daily struggle remained. So reap, endure. Their resilience lay not in conquering the wider world, but in surviving it, in holding fast their small patch of land and their fragile community. In truth, this tension between the local and the global defined medieval village life. The village was both a cage and a refuge, vulnerable to powers beyond it, yet essential to the machinery of kingdoms and empires. Lords and kings depended on peasants more than they admitted. Without their labor, no manor flourished, no army marched, no crown endured. The villagers bore the weight of the world upon their calloused shoulders, unseen yet indispensable. When we think of medieval history, we often focus on knights, monarchs, battles, castles, but the true story is incomplete without the village, quiet, unglamorous foundation on which it all rested. For every shining helm, there were hundreds of bent backs. For every royal banquet, countless loaves of peasant bread. For every church built, there were hands that carried stones and bodies that labored in mud. The villagers themselves may not have thought of their lives as history. To them, life was simply what it was: work, prayer, fear, hope. But in their resilience, their endurance, and their quiet resistance, they shaped the world more profoundly than any knight or king. As the sun set over a medieval village, the world seemed to shrink into something small, fragile, and yet enduring. Smoke curled from thatched roofs, drifting into the evening sky. The lowing of cattle, the cries of children, the toll of the church bellet was a soundscape both humble and eternal. To step into such a moment is to glimpse a life that was both brutally hard and strangely steady, marked by rhythms that tied human existence to the turning of the earth itself. For the villagers, survival was not guaranteed, yet life was not. Devoid of meaning or even joy. The struggle for bread and shelter was real, but within it there was laughter, storytelling, kinship, and love. Around hearths, families gathered. Tales were told, old legends of saints or half-remembered pagan myths. Children played with wooden toys, wrestled in the dirt, or chased chickens through lanes. Women sewed and sang, their voices weaving into the twilight. Men repaired tools or carved wood, their calloused hands never fully at rest. The church dominated. Not only the skyline, but the very texture of their lives. Its bell ordered the hours. Its festivals punctuated the year. Its sacraments gave meaning to birth, marriage, and death. To live in the Middle Ages was to live within the shadow of faith. Sin and salvation were constant companions, and the afterlife loomed larger than the present. Yet, even as the church demanded obedience and tithes, it also offered comfort. In the flickering light of candles, villagers found solace in prayer, in ritual, in the belief that suffering here would lead to peace beyond. Still, darkness lingered always at the edges. Hunger haunted winters. Disease struck without warning. A single failed harvest could unravel a year's work. A single spark could turn homes to ash. The memory of death was close, never distant. Yet precisely because of this, life was cherished. With an intensity modern eyes sometimes overlook. Every loaf of bread, every healthy child, every spring's first blossom carried weight. For it came at a cost, and it could vanish swiftly. Festivals provided rare release from toil. At harvest, when barns were full, the village erupted in feasts, dancing, games. Men donned masks, women braided flowers into their hair. Children shouted gleefully as they watched contests of strength or skill. Music rose from simple instruments, pipes, drums, fiddles cobbled together by hand. For a brief time, hardship gave way to celebration. These moments of joy were not trivial, they were essential. They reminded villagers that beyond labor and pain, life held light, laughter, and community. The village was bound together by ties of obligation, but also by necessity. Neighbors helped each other. One day, a family might lend seed to another in need. Another day, they might share a roof after fire destroyed a home. These bonds of survival forged deep connections. A village was not merely a collection of huts. It was a web of shared fate. To be cast out was often worse than death. To belong was to endure together. Children grew quickly in this environment. Play soon gave way to work. By 7 or 8, they were contributing, tending animals, gathering firewood, carrying water. Their childhood was brief, yet not without wonder. They learned from elders, absorbed stories, and gazed wide-eyed at the mysteries of the world, the stars, the forest, the changing of the seasons. For them, magic and reality were intertwined. Spirits dwelled in woods. Saints walked unseen among fields. Every illness, every harvest, every storm was touched with the supernatural. Marriage bound not only to people but to families. It was a practical affair, yet love could grow within it. Weddings were communal, marked with dancing, ale, and feasting when possible. Death, too, was communal. Funerals gathered the village in mourning, reminding all of their shared fragility. Life was short, but within it, the bonds of family and faith offered continuity. A man might die, but his children tilled his land. A woman might perish, but her songs lived on in her daughters. And yet, as centuries passed, life in the village slowly changed. The Black Death, wars, the rise of towns, the slow decline of feudal obligations reshaped the fabric of rural existence. Some peasants gained new freedoms, others saw their burdens increase. But through all change, the essence of village life remained: toil, faith, fear, hope. For modern eyes, it is tempting to see only the darkness. Disease, hunger, oppression, these were real and they marked every life. But to dwell only on the suffering risks, missing the humanity that persisted within it. Medieval villagers were not merely victims of history. They were human beings with dreams, laughter, love, and dignity. They endured, not by choice, but by necessity and enduring. They carried forward the foundations of the world we now inhabit. When we imagine their lives, we must picture not only the bent figure in the field or the corpse in the plague pit, but also the mother singing softly to her child, the friends sharing ale after harvest, the young couple exchanging nervous smiles at a wedding. These were lives lived fully, even if briefly. The dark truth of the medieval village is not only that it was hard, but that hardship was ordinary, expected, woven into the fabric of existence. And yet, it was within that darkness that resilience glowed most brightly, against the weight of lords and kings, against the sweep of plague and famine, against the slow grind of poverty. They endured. Their story is not one of triumph in the sense of castles and crowns, but of quiet survival, the most profound triumph of all. As the final candle burned low in the humble cottage, as the village settled into silence beneath a star-filled sky, there was no sense of history being made. There was only the simple, eternal act of living, breathing, hoping, fearing, loving. And though centuries have passed, though villages have crumbled into ruins or grown into towns, that essence remains. To study their lives is to study our own beginnings, to see reflected in their struggles the seeds of our modern world. And so, the story ends as it began, not in the halls of kings or the clash of armies, but in the small, unremarkable life of a villager. A life filled with darkness, yes, but also with light enough to carry on.